Strateji Katı'na hoş geldiniz. İsrail ve İran arasında günlerdir devam eden çatışmalar nedeniyle bölgemiz çok hassas ve tehlikeli bir süreçten geçiyor. Gerek iki ülkeden gerekse ABD Başkanı Donald Trump'tan gelen açıklamalar bölgede gerginliğin kısa süre içerisinde azalmayacağını, hatta giderek artabileceğini gösteriyor. Savaşın bölgeye yayılma tehlikesi de varlığını devam ettiriyor. Tabii ki tüm bu gelişmelerin milli güvenlik, küresel ekonomi, iş dünyası ve piyasalar için ne anlama geldiğini yakından takip ediyoruz. İstisnai bir dönemde olduğumuz için bugün Strateji Katı'nda her zamankinden biraz farklı bir yöntem benimseyeceğiz ve bütün bu başlıkları konuğum Marko Papic ile değerlendireceğiz. Marko Papic, BCA Research isimli bağımsız yatırım araştırma ve strateji danışmanlığı firmasında jeopolitik stratejist olarak görev yapıyor. Özellikle jeopolitik riskler ve piyasaya etkileri hakkında derin uzmanlığa sahip. Marko ile bölgedeki mevcut dinamikleri, Türkiye'ye olası etkileri ve piyasa oyuncularının nelere dikkat etmesi gerektiğini konuşacağız. Karar verenlerin referans noktası Strateji Katı başlıyor. So Marko, welcome to the show.
Teşekkür ederim, Emre. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So, while much of the current media coverage is focused on the operational and military dimensions of the Israel-Iran conflict, I would like us to take a step back first of all and look at the bigger picture maybe. So you have long argued that the world is going a deeper geopolitical transformation from a US-led unipolar order to a more fragmented multipolar landscape. So can you please walk us through what this shift actually means and how this particular conflict fits into that larger reordering?
Well, in political science, there's this concept that the world is in an anarchy. And because it's in an anarchy, there's no global government, nobody is really in charge. It is the distribution of power between states that decides how anarchic the system is. If one country acts as a big bully, as a global hegemon, as a global superpower that sets the rules and norms of behavior, it is actually perhaps an unfair world, but it is a relatively stable world. It doesn't have to be the United States, it can be anyone else, it can be China, it can be an alien force. It doesn't really matter as long as one country is in charge. That's a relatively stable system. A bipolar world, which is very familiar to most viewers from the Cold War, it's a world where two superpowers divide the world neatly into two camps. There's a little bit more conflict than in a unipolar world, but for the most part, the two countries are still in charge. And you can't really have a conflict where the two countries are not involved. What we're seeing today, however, is that nobody's really in charge. It's a multipolar world. And various regional powers, such as Russia, such as Israel, are taking matters into their own hands without really checking in first with their allies. And this is an example of that. Israel's unilateral action, while certainly US was involved in it, it wasn't really a US-initiated conflict. And in fact, it could backfire against the US and US interests quite significantly. Nonetheless, Israel didn't really care. And that is not a function of Israeli diplomacy or Israeli thinking. It is a function of a multipolar world where you will see more and more countries take matters into their own hands. So it's a more volatile world.
So because of this volatility, we are seeing maybe, or we are going to see more conflicts in other regions as well. So is this really simply about the relative decline of US hegemony, or are we also witnessing the rise of alternative centers of power, such as China and other regional actors as well?
It's both. It's both at the same time. And in fact, when you say your question, it is literally the same thing. Relative decline doesn't mean necessarily that the US is less powerful. The US can simply be as powerful as it was 10, 20 years ago. But in relative terms, it is the rise of regional powers that creates this multipolar dynamic. And it's not all negative. Yes, the frequency of conflict goes up. That's what political science theory clearly tells us is the case. And history also tells us that when the world is multipolar, there's multiple conflicts going on at the same time. I would say the silver lining of this world, however, is that not every conflict immediately becomes a conflict between nuclear-armed superpowers. I mean, in this particular case, between Israel and Iran, China and the US are somewhat on different sides, but they're not really fighting a proxy battle. So the chances of us going into World War III because of conflicts actually declines in a multipolar world.
And can we say that we are seeing some visible indicators of this shift in the Middle East as well? I know that you are paying too much attention to this recent speech by President Trump in Riyadh, and that it signifies a newer world order maybe. So what do you make of that?
So I thought that President Trump's speech in Riyadh was really important, and thank you for asking that question, because effectively what he said was the U.S. is not going to impose its norms, its ideas on the Middle East. It wants balance. And that, that harkens back to this history of countries playing a role of an offshore balancer, making sure that regions are in equilibrium. And it suggested that the U.S. would play that role in the Middle East going forward. Now, that would require President Trump to actually act on his own words. And supporting Israel in destabilizing Iran would not be a role of an offshore balancer. So he made that speech, I believe, in mid-April or mid-May in Riyadh, so very recently. But then, a few weeks later, the White House is apparently contemplating joining Israel in completely destabilizing the Iranian regime. That would mean that that speech is being delayed or put on ice, if you will, and it wasn't really genuine. So we have to see how the U.S. reacts to the current conflict. If, on the other hand, it stays on the sidelines, lets it play out, and then re-engages with Iran on some diplomatic negotiation, that would be a more appropriate role for an offshore balancer.
And turning to the current crisis, what do you think really motivated Israel's direct strikes on Iranian territory? I mean, beyond the stated security threats, what do you think the bigger or maybe broader strategic calculus of Israel here?
Well, first of all, we have to talk about non-strategic calculus. Clearly, domestic politics played a role and has continued to play a role in Israel. The government of Benjamin Netanyahu has been sort of hanging by a thread. And there are components of the government which are quite, assertive and aggressive, both domestically with the Palestinian issue and regionally. And so I do think that Prime Minister Netanyahu was under immense domestic pressure to act. Second, I do think also that Israel is starting to sense that America is turning Machiavellian, that America is turning a little bit away from, U.S., from Israeli interests, and it's starting to think for itself. And I do think that they were concerned, that Israel was concerned that the U.S. might make a deal that wasn't really strong enough. And so it took matters into its own hands.
Mm-hmm. And earlier you said that the U.S. did not initiate this crisis and did not initiate this, was not involved in the earlier stages of the crisis. So as we stand today, what is the U.S. policy towards the region overall and regarding this conflict in particular? So what do you think is on Trump's mind? Because everybody's trying to read his mind, but it seems like he's also a bit undecided on this.
Well, that's a really difficult question, Emre. I think that, a week ago, it was pretty clear that the U.S. wanted to retain a balance in the region. And that means that, Iranian regime is, an adversary. It's not a friendly regime to the United States. But it is a regime that the United States does not see as a country that needs to be completely changed, completely destroyed. Now, I do think that President Trump is starting to, tinker with the idea, to consider the idea of joining the attacks from a punitive perspective. I think that would undermine the strategy that he has created, which is that he seeks to create regional equilibria that will work in the U.S. favor. There are a lot of dangers to the U.S. from participating in this. First and foremost, attacking Iran in a punitive action could cause oil prices to rise immensely, which would undermine President Trump's domestic agenda on fighting inflation. But also, you could create a real vacuum in Iran. We've seen what happens when you create power vacuums in the Middle East. We've seen the rise in terrorism, and we've seen the destabilization in terms of migration routes due to the intervention by the West in Libya, due to the intervention in Syria, and of course, the two vacuums in Iraq and Afghanistan didn't work out well either. So, it's 4 for 4, or it's 0 for 4. It's not clear why the U.S. would want to destabilize yet another major country in the Middle East.
And from a military and operational standpoint, how would you assess the capabilities of both sides? I mean, were there any particular moves or technologies or vulnerabilities that stood out to you in this round of escalation?
Well, first of all, if you are a consumer of Russian air defense systems, you might want to reconsider. That's the obvious. The S-300s, the S-300 surface-to-air missile has proven to be just absolute trash. It hasn't worked at all. Israeli Air Force pretty much has, free reign over Iran. That was very surprising. On the other hand, I would say that a lot of Western commentators are understating Iran's capabilities. Yes, they're not able to defend themselves against Israeli airstrikes, and they would have absolutely no defense against an American attack. However, it doesn't take that much technological capability to endanger shipping through the Straits of Hormuz. So that's something that I think is very asymmetrical, and I'm not sure that a lot of folks out there understand. Oil prices haven't really risen that much. But if you think about it, that might be because many investors just don't believe in Iran's ability to do anything. Remember, the Houthis, the group in Yemen, has been able to use pretty simple missiles and drones to keep shipping from the Red Sea. And because of that, I think that we have to understand Iran can do the same. It can do the same with very small vessels and drones that are very difficult to pick off. And so we have this asymmetry, Emre, that I think is very dangerous. If Iran decides to interdict shipping in the Straits of Hormuz, it'll be very difficult for the US Navy to prevent that from happening. And therefore, America will shift from defending shipping to a punitive attack against Iran. Because how else do you stop Iran from disrupting flow of energy? You will have to simply stop them through imposing egregious amount of pain on Iran. And so that's where I think for Iran and for Tehran, it's a very difficult decision. I would remind your viewers that in 46 years that we've had the Islamic Republic of Iran, they've never tried to close the Straits of Hormuz. Even during the 8-year Iran-Iraq war, which was very, very painful, 500,000 people died. Saddam Hussein had everybody supporting him, Soviet Union, US, Europe, and yet Iran never really tried to close the Straits because they know that's their nuclear option. If they press that, the retaliation will be massive from the US.
And do you think that's a plausible option right now, or could we be heading toward a more major escalation, something like direct strikes on US bases or cyber attacks on behalf of Iran, of course, or really striking the Strait of Hormuz this time? Or is regime stability in Tehran at risk?
So it's all about regime stability. So if Iran feels that the regime stability is at risk, which I don't think it is, I think it's very difficult to have regime change with an F-16. We've never really seen that happen. In Syria and in Libya, regime change happened. Yes, airstrikes were important, but in Libya's case, there were clearly rebel groups on the ground in Libya. There are no real effective rebel groups in Iran. So I don't think that Iran feels threatened enough to use the nuclear option of attacking the Straits. Now, your point about would they consider attacking US bases? I think they would. Remember that after General Soleimani was killed on January 3rd, 2020, Iran did target US installations in Iraq. And here what I would say to your viewers is that not all American military installations are hierarchically the same. Attacking a small base in Iraq with some US troops in it, that is not the same as attacking, for example, American Air Force assets in Qatar or the Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. So it will really depend on what Iran chooses to strike. And so I would say to your viewers, if they choose to attack American presence in Iraq, that's pretty much expected. If they deviate and go to Bahrain and Qatar, that is much more serious. And then if they choose to close the Straits of Hormuz, at that point, I think the US will attack Iran with quite considerable fire and fury, as President Trump would say.
And of course, being in Turkey, we very closely watch the developments in our region. It's a very troubled region, obviously. So from your perspective, how do you assess Turkey's evolving regional role, and both over the past decades and specifically in the current context?
Well, I think what's interesting on one hand Turkey is a very powerful country in the region that hasn't been involved enough in creating a balance in the region. So in this particular confrontation between Israel and Iran, Turkey hasn't had much of a role at all. However, I think what's very clear is that as each of the countries in the region starts to be destabilized, Turkey's role is going to grow over the next decade. The question is what kind of a role is that going to be? And I think it's very difficult right now for Ankara to be a peacemaker, because of course Turkey and Israel have a very antagonistic relationship at this point. It's going to have to be some other country that acts as an interlocutor. And I thought it was very interesting, and I think Turkey, this could be a very interesting point in Turkey. It's Pakistan's, general who is meeting with Trump today in the White House. Perhaps Pakistan will have a little bit more of a role in trying to bring Israel and Iran to the table. In the future, I think Turkish role, however, will have to increase. You've got, countries that are in different states of effectively competency, Syria, Iraq. To what extent are those countries really in charge of their entire territory? Turkey is going to have an increasingly larger role. And if the permanent state here for the next 5 to 10 years, if the end result of this is a weakened Tehran, then obviously Turkey is the winner in sort of a balance of power.
So let's turn to the markets. The initial reaction has been relatively muted, I would say. So are investors underestimating the risks here, or have markets simply become desensitized to the geopolitical conflict in this region?
I think it's both. It can be both, Emre. So first of all, I would say in a multipolar world, markets will react in sort of a more and more desensitized way. Think of it as half-life. The half-life of hysteria is collapsing. Why? Well, because this is the world we live in. And you should expect this. Like every 6 months, you should expect something like this to happen in a multipolar world. If you don't believe me, study the 19th century. This was par for the course in the 19th century, and investors didn't lose their mind every time there was a conflict here, there, or elsewhere. So that's the first thing. At the same time, I do think that oil prices probably should rise more, especially now that we're starting to contemplate U.S. involvement, and now that the Iranian officials are starting to hint that they could, of course, close the Straits of Hormuz. I think there's going to be a lot of war of words that's going to upset the oil markets. However, let's say a nightmare scenario happens and oil prices go up 50, 75% as Iran starts interdicting shipping in the Straits of Hormuz. I think it will be the greatest alpha harvesting opportunity, maybe this decade, because oil prices cannot stay at that elevated level for too long. The United States of America will punish Iran. It will be extremely painful. It will be extremely effective. And that blockade of the Straits of Hormuz will not last more than 2 to 4 weeks, which means that ultimately the correct move will be to fade the geopolitical risk, which means to short oil. That will be where you will make your money. You will make the money this year by effectively shorting the move in energy prices once they get to nosebleed levels. At the same time, if that's the case, if I'm correct about this, there will be no real negative impact other than temporary on the stock market. Because if energy prices go up 800%, Emre, they can go 1,000%, but then they come down. Did they really go up? The answer is no. And I hear a lot of bearish commentary out there that this could influence central banks to keep interest rates high. There's no way that any central banker in the world is going to raise interest rates because Iran closed the Straits of Hormuz. That would be almost unpatriotic to do. So I'm not bearish on risk assets because of this.
Marko, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and comments with us. It's very important to have you here. Thank you.
It's a welcome. Thank you so much.
Evet, bugün Strateji Katı'nda İran-İsrail Savaşı çerçevesinde BCA Research analisti Marko Papic'i ağırladık. Kendisiyle jeopolitik çatışmanın özellikle bölgemizdeki etkilerini, Türkiye'ye yansımalarını ve özellikle de piyasalar üzerinde ne gibi etkileri olabileceğini konuştuk. Önümüzdeki hafta Strateji Katı'nda yine karar verenlerin referans noktası olacak bir konuyla karşınızda olacağız.